Hey everyone, Kristen Gutierrez, broker associate with eXp Realty, and today I want to get into one of the big topics that's been in the news about the real estate industry lately. And the National Association of Realtors, or NAR as we call it, has been talking about this settlement that they're going to do. So there's been a number of class action lawsuits that have been going on for some years now, and NAR wants to settle a lot of them to kind of move on from this. But because of the settlement agreement, there's going to be some significant changes, probably the single biggest change in the real estate industry, in years. And so I want to kind of go over how that's going to impact people and what it's going to look like kind of going forward. So currently, and for years and years and years, typically when a listing agent takes a listing with the seller as part of that contract, and by the way, this settlement applies to all states, so this isn't a California specific thing or whatever, it's all states. But when that listing agent takes the listing agreement, listing contract with the seller, in that contract, typically they negotiate the commission, and then there's usually some portion of that commission that is then offered to the buyer's agent. This has always worked really well, sort of this process. Again, not required, and it's always been something that sellers can negotiate how much is being paid and everything, but it still has been sort of just kind of the norm on how things were often done. And what was good about it, and what worked well, is that oftentimes buyers are already having to save up 3.5%, 5%, 10%, 20% to put down on the house that they're buying. And then on top of that, in addition to that down payment, they can have 2%, 3%, 4% closing costs, additional closing costs, just in order for them to buy the home. And so what was nice about, or is nice about, kind of our current system and the current way that we do things, is that this allowed buyers to get representation from a separate agent typically, and the seller was helping to kind of pay that, right? Now, in addition, understand that sometimes there are buyers that do not have a lot of money to pay their closing costs or pay their down payment. And so oftentimes, even now, when we are representing buyers in the purchase contract, we will sometimes ask the seller to assist in paying some of the buyer's closing costs. So it can be very common, especially with first-time home buyers or some VA loans or FHA loans, where we are asking the seller to contribute 2% or 3% of the purchase price to go towards the buyer's closing costs. Okay, so that's sort of like what we kind of do now. What's happening, oh, and to go back just a little bit, in the MLS, so the multiple listing service, which is where agents put their listings, and then the listings are kind of disseminated out to all those other websites too, like Zillow and Realtor.com and all of those. But in the MLS, there is a field typically where we as agents can see sort of what the listing agent and seller are offering to pay the buyer's agent. Okay, so part of the single kind of biggest thing about the NAR litigation and their agreeing to settle is that field in the MLSs is going to go away, and sellers are no longer going to be able to offer in the MLS specific commission to be paid to the buyer's agents. Okay, so what does that mean going forward? So starting on August 17th, the large majority of us as realtors, first of all, when we represent a buyer, if currently now when we help a buyer find a house, if we have a buyer that calls us and says, hey, can you show me this house? We don't have to have them sign any contract with us, and we can take them to immediately to go see a house. Starting as of August 17th, we will now all be required to have buyers sign a contract or a buyer representation agreement with us before we are allowed to now show a home. In that buyer representation agreement, we need to lay out with the buyer very clearly what it is that we are charging them for our services and for our time. It can be an hourly fee, it can be a flat fee, it can be a percentage, like it kind of typically is now. But the way that buyer's agents are going to get paid is going to start off by being the buyer's responsibility. Okay. Now, for some buyers, that's fine. There may be buyers who have, who have cash to buy a house and they have the money to pay their buyer's agents and all of that. And so that, won't impact them very much. For those buyers who maybe do not have the, 2%, 3%, 1.5%, whatever it is that is negotiated, or that hourly rate or whatever that they negotiate with their buyer's agent to pay them, when they are writing an offer on a house, they can now request that in the offer that the seller contribute towards paying what the buyer has agreed to pay the agent, right? So we're sort of taking what was kind of over here in this column, seller was typically kind of offering to pay the buyer's agent, and we're just moving that number. Seller may ultimately end up paying it, but we're sort of moving what column it kind of comes out of. Okay. And if the seller accepts the offer and agrees to it, then they will pay it. If the seller offers to negotiates to pay some portion of what the buyer agreed to pay their buyer's agent, then the buyer would be responsible for the additional amount, right? So if the buyer said that they would pay their agent 2% and the seller says, I'm only going to pay 1%, then the buyer would then owe their agent that other 1%. Okay. There's some other things kind of attached to this. And I can say, there's a lot of people in the industry that think, that this is going to be, or maybe outside of the industry, that think that this is somehow going to bring pricing down. I don't personally see sellers suddenly going, oh, I don't have to pay a buyer's agent, so I'm going to lower the price of my house, that kind of stuff. I think, it'll probably just mean we're going to be negotiating commissions more. The one challenge is, of course, that for buyers in the past who were already asking for assistance with closing costs, their offers were often difficult to get accepted if they were competing with other offers. And now we're going to be impacting, again, those same buyers who may not have as much money available to buy, by requiring them or kind of forcing them to ask for even more concessions from the seller just so they can get representation from a real estate agent. So anyways, we'll keep talking about this. It's a huge thing. We are learning more and more. Our California attorneys are working on this. All the different states are kind of working on how we're going to handle this and be able to represent our clients well and do a great job for us. So there'll be more to come, but that's kind of where we are as of now. And August 17th is that target date. So for more real estate related subjects and information, check out our other videos on our YouTube channel.